On the morning of November 6, 1956, the sun rose over the Suez Canal to reveal a scene of total military victory. British and French paratroopers had secured the canal zone. Israeli tanks had swept across the Sinai Peninsula in a lightning campaign that had humiliated the Egyptian army. The operation had been executed with surgical precision. The three Allied powers stood on the verge of toppling Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president who had dared to nationalize the canal and who had become the symbol of Arab defiance against the old colonial order. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden stood in the war rooms beneath Whitehall, exhausted but triumphant. He believed he had pulled off the greatest gambit of his career. He had coordinated a secret invasion with the French and the Israelis to reclaim Britain's most valuable strategic asset. The Suez Canal was the jugular vein of the British Empire. It was the shortcut to India, to the oil fields of the Persian Gulf, to the markets of Asia. Losing control of it was unthinkable. Eden had studied history. He had seen what happened when dictators were appeased. He had watched Neville Chamberlain bow to Hitler at Munich. He was determined not to repeat that mistake. Nasser, in his mind, was the new Mussolini, and Eden would crush him before he could spread his poison across the Middle East. But as Eden stood there savoring what he thought was victory, a telephone rang. The call was from the British Treasury. The voice on the other end was panicked. The Chancellor of the Exchequer delivered a message that would change the course of history more decisively than any tank or bomber. He told the Prime Minister that the pound sterling was collapsing. He told him that Britain was hours away from a financial catastrophe that would dwarf the military success in Egypt. He told him that the United States were orchestrating the destruction of the British economy and that unless Eden ordered an immediate ceasefire and withdrew from Egypt, the United States would allow Britain to go bankrupt. Eden's face turned white. He realized in that moment that he had miscalculated everything. He had planned for a military operation, but he had walked into an economic trap. The British Empire, which had survived 2 world wars, which had stood alone against Hitler, was about to be brought to its knees not by Soviet missiles or Arab nationalism, but by a phone call from Washington and a run on the currency markets. To understand how Britain found itself in this impossible position, we have to go back to the beginning of the crisis, to the summer of 1956. The Suez Canal had been the property of an international company, the Suez Canal Company, which was majority owned by British and French shareholders. For decades, this company was a license to print money. Every ship that passed through the canal paid a toll, and those tolls enriched the shareholders in London and Paris. The canal was a physical manifestation of European dominance over the global economy. It was a reminder that even after the colonies gained independence, the infrastructure of empire remained in Western hands. But Nasser had other plans. He was the leader of the Free Officers Movement, a group of young Egyptian army officers who had overthrown the corrupt King Farouk in 1952. Nasser was a nationalist, a charismatic figure who spoke the language of Arab pride and anti-imperialism. He looked at the Suez Canal and saw a national humiliation. It was a vital waterway running through the heart of Egypt, yet the Egyptians saw almost none of the profits. The tolls went to shareholders in Europe while Egyptian workers earned poverty wages. Nasser wanted to build the Aswan High Dam, a massive infrastructure project that would control the flooding of the Nile, generate electricity, and transform Egyptian agriculture. It was a symbol of modernity, of a new Egypt rising from the ashes of colonialism. He asked the United States and Britain to finance the dam. Initially, they agreed, but then Nasser made a move that terrified the West. He purchased weapons from Czechoslovakia, a Soviet satellite state. He recognized communist China. He was playing the 2 superpowers off against each other, trying to extract the best deal for Egypt. The Americans, led by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, were furious. Dulles was a rigid Cold Warrior who saw the world in black and white. If you weren't with America, you were with the communists. Nasser's flirtation with the Soviets was unforgivable. In July 1956, Dulles abruptly withdrew the American offer to finance the Aswan Dam. It was a public humiliation designed to teach Nasser a lesson. Nasser's response was swift and devastating. On July 26, 1956, he stood before a massive crowd in Alexandria and delivered a speech that electrified the Arab world. He announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company. The canal, he declared, belonged to Egypt. The tolls would now be used to finance the Aswan Dam. The crowd erupted in celebration. Across the Middle East, Nasser became a hero overnight. He had stood up to the old colonial powers and taken back what was rightfully Egypt's. In London and Paris, the reaction was apoplectic. Anthony Eden flew into a rage. He saw Nasser's move not as a legitimate act of sovereignty, but as theft. British government had guaranteed the shares of the Suez Canal Company. British pension funds held those shares. British shipping companies depended on the canal. Eden became obsessed. He ordered his intelligence services to find a way to remove Nasser from power. He compared Nasser to Hitler in cabinet meetings, saying that appeasing dictators only made them stronger. The French were equally enraged. France was fighting a brutal war in Algeria, and Nasser was supporting the Algerian rebels with money and propaganda. The French government believed that if they crushed Nasser, the Algerian revolt would collapse, so Britain and France began to plot. They needed a pretext for war, a justification that would allow them to invade Egypt without looking like naked aggressors. This is where Israel entered the picture. Israel in 1956 was a young nation surrounded by hostile Arab states. Egypt had been blockading Israeli shipping through the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's access to the Red Sea. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion saw an opportunity. If Israel attacked Egypt and Britain and France intervened to separate the combatants, they could seize the canal under the guise of peacekeeping. The three nations met in secret at a villa in Sèvres outside Paris. They hatched a plan that was as cynical as it was brilliant. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum demanding that both Egypt and Israel withdraw from the canal zone. When Egypt inevitably refused, Britain and France would invade to protect the canal. It was a conspiracy wrapped in a lie, wrapped in a military operation. On October 29, 1956, Israeli forces launched their assault. They moved with stunning speed, cutting through Egyptian defenses and racing toward the canal. The next day, Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Nasser, as expected, rejected it. On October 31st, British and French bombers began pounding Egyptian airfields. On November 5th, paratroopers landed at Port Said. The invasion had begun. But there was one problem. The conspirators had forgotten to ask the United States for permission. President Dwight Eisenhower was in the final week of his re-election campaign when he received the news. He was blindsided. His closest allies had launched a war in the Middle East without consulting him. Eisenhower was furious, not because he liked Nasser, but because the invasion was a catastrophic strategic blunder. The Soviets were crushing a rebellion in Hungary at that exact moment. The West was supposed to be the champion of freedom and self-determination. How could America criticize Soviet aggression while its own allies were invading Egypt? Eisenhower also understood something that Eden did not. The world had changed since 1945. Britain and France were no longer superpowers. They were middle powers pretending to be empires. And in the New World Order, economic power mattered more than military might. Eisenhower decided to teach them that lesson. The weapon he chose was the pound sterling. Since the end of World War II, Britain had been struggling to maintain the value of its currency. The pound was still a reserve currency held by central banks around the world, but it was fragile. Britain's economy was weak. It was running a trade deficit. It had burned through its gold reserves during the war. The only thing holding the pound up was confidence, the belief that the British government would defend its value. That confidence was built on a foundation of loans and credit lines from the United States and the International Monetary Fund. Britain was essentially living on American financial life support, and Eisenhower controlled the valve. As soon as the invasion began, speculators in the currency markets smelled blood. They started selling pounds, betting that Britain would be forced to devalue. This created a run on the currency. The Bank of England was hemorrhaging foreign exchange reserves, spending millions of dollars every day to buy pounds and prop up the price. Within a week, Britain's reserves were nearly exhausted. The British Treasury sent an urgent message to Washington. They needed help. They needed the IMF to release an emergency loan. They needed the United States to support the pound. The message was clear. If America did not step in, Britain would have to abandon the defense of sterling, which would trigger a devaluation, spike inflation, and potentially collapse the British economy. This was the moment Eisenhower had been waiting for. He picked up the phone and called Anthony Eden. The conversation was brief and brutal. Eisenhower told Eden that there would be no IMF loan, there would be no American support for the pound, not until British and French troops withdrew from Egypt immediately and unconditionally. Eden tried to argue. He explained that British forces were on the verge of total victory. He said they just needed a few more days. Eisenhower cut him off. He told Eden that every hour British troops remained in Egypt, the pound would fall further. He told him that the United States would not lift a finger to help until the withdrawal was complete. He told him, in effect, that Britain could choose between the Suez Canal and the British economy. It could not have both. Eden was trapped. He called an emergency cabinet meeting. The Chancellor of the Exchequer laid out the brutal math. Britain was losing reserves at a rate that would exhaust them within days. If the pound collapsed, the cost of imports would skyrocket. Britain imported half its food. A currency crisis would mean food shortages, unemployment, and social unrest. The government would fall. The empire would be finished. The military commanders were stunned. They had won the battle. Their forces controlled the canal, and now they were being told to retreat because of accountants and currency traders. But the numbers did not lie. Britain's vaunted military power was meaningless if it could not pay for fuel and ammunition. On November 6th, just hours after achieving military success, Eden announced a ceasefire. The next day, he agreed to a full withdrawal. The operation was over. The British and French forces pulled out in humiliation, replaced by a United Nations peacekeeping force. Nasser, who had been on the verge of defeat, emerged as the victor. He had been saved not by his army, but by American economic pressure on his enemies. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Anthony Eden's health collapsed under the stress. He resigned in January 1957, a broken man. He would be remembered not as the statesman who stood up to dictators, but as the fool who launched the last gasp of British imperialism and was crushed by his own ally.
The Suez Crisis marked the definitive end of British and French pretensions to great power status. It proved that military force without economic strength was useless. It demonstrated that in the post-war world, the United States was the only Western superpower, and it would not tolerate its allies acting independently. For France, the lesson was equally bitter. The French government concluded that they could never again rely on the United States. This humiliation accelerated France's development of an independent nuclear deterrent and its eventual withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command. Charles de Gaulle, who returned to power in 1958, built his entire foreign policy on the principle that France must never again be subject to American economic blackmail. But the deepest irony of the Suez Crisis is what happened to the canal itself. Nasser kept it. He kept control of the tolls, and within a few years he had successfully operated the canal without British or French management, proving that the colonial argument that Egyptians were incapable of running their own infrastructure was always a lie. The strategic value of the canal, which Eden had been willing to destroy his government to protect, began to decline almost immediately. The development of supertankers that were too large to fit through the canal meant that oil from the Persian Gulf increasingly traveled around the Cape of Good Hope. The canal remained important, but it was no longer the irreplaceable lifeline it had been in the age of steam. The Suez Crisis also had a profound impact on the Middle East. Nasser's victory made him the undisputed leader of the Arab world. His brand of secular Arab nationalism spread like wildfire. It inspired coups and evolutions from Iraq to Libya. It convinced a generation of Arabs that they could stand up to the West and win. But Nasser's triumph was also the beginning of a deeper tragedy. The humiliation of Britain and France created a power vacuum in the Middle East. The United States stepped in to fill that vacuum, not with direct colonial rule, but with a network of allies, military bases, and covert operations. The CIA began to view every nationalist movement in the region as a potential threat. The obsession with controlling Middle Eastern oil intensified. The seeds of decades of American military intervention, from the Lebanon crisis of 1958 to the Iraq War of 2003, were planted in the wreckage of Suez.
For Britain, the Suez Crisis was the final proof that the age of empire was over. The illusion that Britain could project power east of Suez was shattered. Over the next decade, Britain withdrew from nearly all of its remaining colonies. It retreated to Europe, eventually joining the European Economic Community in 1973, accepting that its future lay as a middle-sized European power, not as a global hegemon. The financial mechanism that Eisenhower used in 1956, threatening to withhold IMF support and allowing a currency crisis to force a policy change, became a template for American power. It was economic warfare disguised as multilateral technocracy.
The United States would use this weapon again and again, from the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s to the Asian financial crisis of 1997, proving that in the modern world, control of the global financial system is more powerful than control of the seas. The lesson of Suez is that sovereignty without solvency is an illusion. Britain and France learned that they were only as independent as their balance of payments allowed. They could deploy their armies, but if they could not defend their currencies, their militaries were just expensive theater. Today, as we watch new powers rise and old alliances strain, the ghost of Suez lingers. When nations speak of strategic autonomy, of reducing dependence on the dollar, of building alternative payment systems, they are trying to escape the trap that snared Eden in 1956. They understand the true power in the 21st century does not come from aircraft carriers alone. It comes from the ability to withstand financial pressure, to operate outside the economic architecture controlled by Washington. The Suez Crisis was the moment the British Lion learned that it had been declawed not by an enemy, but by its own protector. It was the moment the empire realized that the special relationship was a relationship between master and client, not between equals. And it was the moment the world learned that in the age of globalized finance, a telephone call from the White House could achieve what armies could not. The tanks rolled back, the flags were lowered, and the pound, temporarily saved by the withdrawal, continued its long, slow decline, a currency whose value rested not on gold or guns, but on the goodwill of a distant power that had proven it could withdraw that goodwill in an instant. If you think there's something we missed or a topic you want us to cover, let's discuss it in the comments. Subscribe now and stay ahead. When history is written, you'll be one of the few who saw it coming.